our listeners, good to have you with us today. My name is Henrik Palmgren, and this is our third part in our mini-series that we are doing together with our guest Michael Tsarion. The second segment, our last program, we left off talking briefly about something called the Mysterium, the philosophical aspect, both to tyranny and control in regards to Michael's research. And this is what we're going to go into in detail about in today's program. I, of course, urge you to go into our archive, listen to part 1 and 2 of this miniseries to get the full background. And as you probably know, Michael's website is michaeltsarion.com. That's Michael, Tsarion.com. And again, just to mention this, that his research is extensive and goes into many different areas, and I suggest you use his site as a portal to go to the individual sites to find out more about his work. So with that, welcome back to Red Ice Radio again, Michael.
Thanks, Henrik. Nice to be on.
You know, last show you brought up Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, and you highlighted these very interesting quotes that you sent me. One was from B.M. Skinner himself that kind of reveals his, mentality regarding mankind, control as well, and basically how mankind is supposed to survive the future and whatnot. The other one was from J.B. Watson, who was an advisor to the advertising industry and an associate to Skinner. And he wrote the following: its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. The behaviorists in this effort to get a unitary scheme of animal response recognize no individual line between man and brute. That's kind of revealing in regards to his relationship basically to man as well. And again, just to emphasize, he had a background in the advertising industry. And again, the second quote that you found, Michael, from B.F. Skinner, maybe you can read that for us, and this reveals some of his mentality as well.
Yeah, because it turned out that he also was had written a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, kind of a worrisome title right there, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. But the line that corresponds is, quote, in this chapter, or actually this may be it's partly a commentary on the book, and it's partly his quote. It says, in this chapter, Skinner argues that a technology of behavior is possible, and that it can be used to help solve currently pressing human situations such as overpopulation and warfare. And the quote from Skinner is, almost all major problems involve human behavior, and they cannot be solved by physical or biological technology alone. What is needed is a technology of human behavior.
Wow. How about that? Maybe, again, you can just mention, what is the relationship between J.B. Watson and Skinner? Were they working together, or what was the deal there?
Yeah, they were famous behaviorists. These are a school of ideology, basically, that started with Ivan Pavlov over in Russia, and again, based on much more shadowy figures that in the last show, indicated that people should check into that, because again, media likes to put these people in front of us as just solo scientists, in the same way that the Microsoft people were put in front of us, or Hewlett Packard were put in front of us as just, Birkenstock wearing garage geeks, and so forth. And then we think no more of it, But these people were putting into plan, they were just instruments putting into plan a very powerful socialism is not just about sociology, it's about technology. It's about viewing man as having no consciousness at all, in the way that we described that Hegel had, in my opinion, quite rightly surmised philosophically, and that man has no real individual consciousness, therefore should be considered a social entity, that his rights will be delivered to him by the state, and that the state, can also decide what is the true function of a man. It's not going to be the function that Plato and Aristotle and other philosophers theorized, whether you agree with them or you don't. But these particular positivistic, materialistic behaviorist philosophers believe that, look, the state will decide.
Yeah.
We have a debt, we have a civilization to build, we have machines to run, we have factories to operate, so get on with it. We will decide what you do and how much even so-called free time you have. We will decide on this. We know how much food you should have. We know what ingredients it should have so that you don't get angry and you don't get malnutrited. We know how much sex you should have, how much TV, circuses, and bread, circuses. We'll decide all of this, and because we know what's right for you.
Yeah. Exactly.
And just like we emphasized so much in the last show, which is why we did this in 3 parts, is to show that, look, once you realize that man cannot be forcibly made into a slave, that the entire slavery matrix is based on his complicity to it, because he's the one who signs on the dotted line and goes, yeah, okay, I'll accept your credit money, your funny money, your faux money.
Yeah.
I'll accept all the imported goods and services that you provide. I'll pay for the police. I'll donate half of my earnings to the federal system. You see, I'm for that. I'm good. Yep, let's go ahead. And then we build civilization in this model.
You know, I watched some of the videos that you sent me in regards to legal empowerment, basically from Robert Menard. Very, very interesting, which details in great detail basically how the participatory relationship that we have to this, that we give up our freedom. And I'm actually going to try to link those up on the main website on Red House Creations as well, because those needs to be seen by more people. Really good videos, Michael.
That's they are, and all the other links, really, even the ones we'll do today, emphasize that people need to get hold of this, these facts, because again, what's happening now, as we said last time, a lot of this alternative research material is being co-opted. Will now be spoon-fed to you by certain shows that are going to start popping up, and even movies, and so people can get confused, unless they are really up to speed on some of the stuff. But again, coming even back to Watson and these people, you know that their ideas were vagrant because they were resisted at the time. This book that Watson wrote, for instance, was completely dismissed by intellectuals of his time
what
as idiotic.
What happened to him?
He had to retire. He became an alcoholic. He became a hermit, some sort of Looney Tunes that lived on a farm, out in the middle of nowhere, and basically drank himself to death, basically. And then before he died, he even burned every single one of his notes and all his papers. He destroyed them, which just shows you how much faith ultimately he had. It's that old Woodrow Wilson thing on their deathbed. They're, and the Theodore Herzls on their deathbed, they're moping and crying about how they pushed forward an agenda that was totally dehumanized. Even they couldn't stomach it.
There's several as well. I know, for instance, didn't Nietzsche have a similar thing? He broke down in Turin as well. The idea of the Superman, he couldn't keep it up any longer, so he allegedly went mad right there on the spot when he saw a horse being whipped or something like that.
Yeah, there is that story. Of course, he did go mad, and then his sister completely exploited his image and grew his big mustache out and made him look completely a caricature of who he was. And she just minted money out of him. I think he lasted for like 16 years after he was basically pronounced insane. And that's a whole separate story there. Of course,
Yeah.
I mean, again, since we're doing a show on philosophy today, it's very important to realize that when you're speaking specifically about philosophers, you have to be wary of using words like wrong and right. Every man who thinks about reality is not wrong. You may disagree with what they come up with, or let's say specifically, you may disagree with what's called their moral or social philosophy. But that's your interpretation, just as they had interpretations. When you're dealing in the realm of philosophy, the common or garden criticisms and he's bad, he's good, this is wrong and this is right, have no significance at all, you see. So it's all about examining the world. So
what you're saying in one regard that the discipline of philosophy have a certain set of rules that it abides to, the same way that the scientific principle is at least supposed to be abiding by certain rules, right?
Yeah, I think so. And not ever to forget that if you're truly an academic philosopher, people need to realize that a single philosopher like a Hegel is actually 3 men in one. There are 3 philosophers in one. This has to be thoroughly understood. A philosopher has, by definition, to have what's called a metaphysics, meaning he has to explain the creation and he has to explain God. Then he has what's called an epistemology section of his thought, which is how does man come to know what he knows? In other words, how does man form his ideas, his understanding, and his conceptions? How does the brain work, and how does memory work, and all of that? And then thirdly, he has a moral philosophy, which is how his ideas will then, how he advises man to adopt his metaphysics and epistemology and then apply it into the world. So even when you're dealing with a single philosopher, you could be actually dealing with a philosopher who has a brilliant metaphysics, but a really shady moral philosophy, or quite the reverse. You could have a Nietzsche. Let's take Nietzsche, for example. He has a certain metaphysics, which we all know, that God is dead. There is no meaning in life except what you give it. But his moral philosophy, in my opinion, could be marvelous, which is there should be no government control. Man should just be free to do as he wants to do. So it depends, again, what area of the philosopher you're critiquing. To critique the philosopher as a whole can sometimes be extremely misgiven. For instance, a Hegel could have an incredibly beautiful, elegant beautifully worked out, highly perceptive metaphysical construct, and even a beautiful idea of metaphysics. This is of epistemology. This is certainly true for Plato and Aristotle. Their epistemologies were just exquisitely worked out. But then in Hegel's case, he have a moral philosophy which is absolutely reprehensible, which is tantamount to the global village. So then again, when a person comes along and wants to critique these guys, they have to make it clear what it is they're critiquing. Are they critiquing their social philosophy, or are they critiquing their metaphysics, and so on? They have to be specific about that. And of course, in today's world, nobody's specific about that, because nobody could give a damn about philosophy in general. And even when they have these criticisms against philosophers, they usually are very misapplied. We tried to give one example about Hegel in the previous talk there, that it's not about his dialectic that is really the problem with Hegel. In fact, the dialectic had been created by philosophers even earlier than him. His particular moral philosophy was based on that he believed, and I believe rightly so, that man has no sense of personal uniqueness or identity at all. It's a social persona that he has.
Is this some of the things that you studied? I mean, you told me before that you took philosophy classes in Belfast.
Yeah, it was just, and I think I got it wrong. In the last show, I thought it was 1986. It was actually 1998. It was 1988 and 89 for 2 years. On the advice of a friend who was much more academically brilliant than I am. He's seen me just moping about the house, on the dole and all this kind of crap. So he says, why don't you go down there and sign on? And I had a history of hating academica like you can't even believe. There is no one on earth who hated school more than I did. And it was a very big decision. And he basically coaxed me to go down. When they sign you up and you can actually go and sit at a cubicle and meet your teacher and have a bit of banter back and forth, And I don't even know what compelled me to go down there. And I met with Alan, who was my teacher at the time, and it kind of clicked. And I felt that I wasn't going after a degree or anything like that, because I knew my limitations. I knew I couldn't get one. I used to suffer from tremendous, examination angst, or whatever they want to call it.
Yeah.
So I've never done things for reasons like that. I did it because I thought it'd be a great idea to, go down and use the brain, you know what I mean, and drink in some of these heavy philosophies, because my upbringing had always shown me that man is suffering. The human race is suffering. Even those with a smile on their face, even those who have a lot of things going for them in life, underneath all of mankind, there is an element of suffering going on.
Yep.
And that is what philosophy is all about, is to explain, what that is. So I went down there in 88 and took those classes, and it was wonderful. The school was literally crumbling. It was an old building. It was falling down, and there was no heat in the schoolrooms. We were sitting there shivering, sometimes drenched. Literally, myself, I had to walk for 3 miles to get to the place, and sometimes that was through storms and rain, and you'd sit there for hours and soaking wet.
And this is during terrorist attack times as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it was. In fact, it's interesting you should say that, because to get to the college, where it was about 3 miles away from my house, I had to walk in about 7 o'clock in the morning, and had to walk through an extremely sectarian area, a total IRA enclave, and was constantly being bricked, as we call it in Ireland, being bricked by the muckers, the wee muckers. Would come out and brick you,
Okay.
And it's a funny thing, because it was it was a little disconcerting to hear philosophy coming from the mouths of these little muckers as they're throwing bricks at you. Yeah, hey nigger, hey kunta kinte, where are you from? Where are you going? Where do you think where do you think you're from? Where do you think you're going? Yeah. And I felt in my mind would be like, well, actually, I'm heading down to philosophy class to answer both those questions. Here's your bricks back, you wee bastards,
Oh God.
Where are you coming from and where are you going? Coming out of the mouth of these guys.
Yeah.
It was kind of extraordinary, but yes, it was during these very troubled times, and there was, again, I had copped out of that. You see, I didn't want to have anything to do with this kind of malarkey in Ireland. So going to college and hanging out with my friend, we were trying to, educate ourselves in whatever primitive way that we could possibly, and it was just because the teacher was so good. And he told the whole class, because many of the class contained people who were taking seminary degrees, philosophy classes, people who are going to go on and become pastors and priests. And he even told them, as he told us, to leave all your prejudices at the door. You're now in a philosophical mindset, and you have to open your minds accordingly. And of course, this was really great,
Mm-hmm. And then you took it from there over to the States, then, right?
Well, of course, after the class was over, I left that same year, and it was in '89 that I came back to the States, and immediately, continued in whatever way I could, just through reading books, for about 2 years before things changed, and I took a different road of study, which eventually got more into psychology and film history and what have you. Yeah, for the first 2 years, I basically continued those studies as well as I could, especially reading people like Spinoza. And then I took 5 years of just reading Heidegger, particularly his one masterpiece. And I couldn't understand a word of it, but I have this belief, you see, that studying philosophy, even if it's a guy you don't agree with, there's something beautiful about the way that philosophers write. There's just the simple way that they use words, the way that they think about life, whether it's Descartes or Ayn Rand. I express it as like food for the mind. So it's not necessarily that you agree or disagree or even understand what they're saying. There's something enriching and nurturing about just studying logical ideas, people who think about the world and then write it down in a beautifully logical, sometimes even poetic way. This is certainly the case with Martin Heidegger, and also even philosophically minded poets like Rainer Maria Rilke, you see, in the German Hölderlin, and Novalis, and many other people like this. It's a world of its own when you get into it, even if you come out at the end going, look, I don't really agree with this particular person's thought,
Well, you're definitely going to be richer in terms of your vocabulary. You might be able to express things that you feel, or your theories about the world, and again, by getting a counter position to your own view, so to speak, you define yourself more, you define your belief more by reading something you don't agree with. So I think it's a very good thing, actually, always.
Yes, and again, it's good to be challenged. Like in philosophy class, you leave every time the class was over, we left as changed people. When the teacher is telling you there that, look, the reason, say for instance in philosophy they talk about the reason, and there's even whole groups of philosophers called rationalists. And when you discover that your human reason is that part of you that is meant to monitor all other parts of you so that no one prejudice, no one emotion, no one vagrant aspect of your being can outweigh the other and create a disequilibrium within your own consciousness. The Stoics talked about this, the rationalists did. They were looking for a mean, they were looking for a place in which to view the world in which no particular prejudiced or imbalanced mindset caused you suffering, caused you pain, caused you to see the world with distorted eyes. When you have teachings like that, it really changes you, because you're then going to drop some of these ridiculous social prejudices that you have, and it's a journey towards actual selfhood and how do I see the world as opposed to other people. Things like this are very, very, very important.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about the Mysterium. Give us an overarching image of what you're talking about when you say that.
Well, yeah, the article I wrote, it's called Disciples of the Mysterium, and that is based on my work on existential psychology, but tying into Martin Heidegger's concepts of being in regards existential philosophy. Normally, philosophers never talk about psychology, and even academically, you're not meant to use anything outside the discipline of philosophy to answer philosophical questions. What this means is that they're mutually exclusive, and if you're talking philosophy, try to answer the questions of life and meaning through philosophical analysis. They don't usually stray over and borrow from psychology. Of course, I think this is a tremendous mistake, because I'm a multidisciplinarian and believe that they should. And you will have social commenters like Leonard Schlein and Alan Bloom, who are neither psychologists or philosophers, who have the right, or even Howard Zinn, you see, certain social commenters who have the right to then use, to be eclectic and to comment from all things, from psychology and even sociology and philosophy, to analyze the world. But if you're strictly within the philosophical movement, you're not really permitted to do that. However, Otto Rank, Rollo May, and Viktor Frankl and Erich Fromm, certain neo-Freudians, basically started to alter what Freud had said, and they developed school. It's strictly Otto Rank who did it, created what's called an existential psychological movement. So as you see, the word existentialism comes from philosophy, and psychology is psychological. So they kind of created this bridge between the philosophical world of existentialism and psychology. So under that umbrella, then, you are in somewhat allowed to then fuse the two together. And under that auspices of existential psychology, which is what I'm into, and also the teachings of Martin Heidegger, and through him to earlier teachings like Taoism and Zen, you have then this basically a philosophy that helps to explain the world. More specifically, when you come at it from the existential psychological point of view, the Mysterium is nothing less, as we talked about before, a theory of human neurosis, given that all psychologists must really address themselves to human
neurosis.
And to pathology.
And is that just a what kind of, is that an unwritten rule, or why is that? Why do they have to address that?
Oh, it's basic. You're not a psychologist if you don't. You're then a sociologist or a philosopher or whatever. But thinking goes wrong. People have pathology. There's people do sadistic things. They're masochistic. They have derangements of the mind. Of course, this is well known from even earlier ages. And so the psychologist is meant to address that with a view to healing it. They're healers. They're people who try to look into what causes hysteria or schizophrenia or psychosis or neurosis. And many of the existential philosophers believe that, listen, everybody has this. It's not just a bunch. It's only more pronounced in those who, are more extreme cases who might go and see a psychologist. But the existential psychologists are quite aware that everyone walking around has some sort of dementia, either mini dementia or major dementia. And that can start in the home, even the way the family unit operates and so forth and so on, why people do the crazy things they do, why soldiers go and join armies, why people, are so violent towards the earth. Because also never let us ever doubt that man's greatest violence, the greatest violence that man perpetrates and commits, is towards nature. And so all of this activity is obviously not sane. Man does not operate sanely. His societies are not sane. And so, yes, a psychologist is the one who sort of looks into that on an individual level to find out what are the roots of derangement. It works perfectly with those who have a conspiratorial mindset because, again, the consciousness of human beings is determined largely by the society. This is even agreed by Freud. He believed that the mechanism within our consciousness, that he called the superego, that conditions our behavior, is largely a mouthpiece for the world. First for the parents. The parents are the first imago that a child knows. And then later on, you need to conform to society. And so therefore, a man's identity, both his positive aspects of his identity and his deranged aspects of his identity, are pretty much the products of the world. And of course, the conspiratorialist will say, okay, look, if the world is deranged, if the world is run by psychopaths, it works in reverse. Man himself will be embody those psychopathic tendencies. And this is the whole reason why my work focuses on look at the individual only, because it's inner tyranny that is being projected onto the world, and it's a feedback loop. Mind affects world, world affects mind, and it keeps on going. And if you see things in history getting worse and worse and worse, you're never going to fix it by running out into the political milieu with a hammer and tongs trying to mend it. You must look at what is creating it and originating it, and that inevitably takes you into the realm of psychology and existential psychology in particular, but also certain elements of philosophy. Now, as you say, I've held that back until now because I had to lay the groundwork so that, another perspective, another sort of way that this is sidelit, this whole complex, the predicament of mankind, is from a philosophical standpoint. And how it sort of began to take place is after I wrote the Atlantis book. I couldn't do it in the Atlantis book because it would have taken it off in a completely different direction. But after finishing that book, it suddenly dawned on me that why is it then that all academic philosophers, including the earliest ones, never took on board the fact that there was a great cataclysm of Earth that then traumatized or disaffected man's mind. Then you scroll forward to the modern age, and you have even great psychologists like Julian Jaynes picking up on this, although he didn't really define what trauma it was. Mm-hmm. He can basically date. He says that the ego, as we know it, has a date of birth, and it comes from a very recent period of time, and describes in his work that the voice of the ego appeared almost like a foreign voice, like an invader. It was a godlike voice that entered into man's mind just before the Homeric period, the period of Homer, and appeared like an alien kind of voice. And to be more specific about it, he claims that what we know as subjectivity, and subjectivity is nothing more than your view, your vision of your own selfhood, idea, even if it's illusion. Later on we'll talk about it being illusionary, but imagine for a moment it's not illusionary. Your own sense of identity, the person you think you are, that the guy down the street, your neighbor, everyone you've lived with has a unique vision of themselves and a vision of their own separate identity. That can be dated basically from the moment that the ego was born, and the psychologists agree. They claim that there's a two things comes into existence: the ego, and then a man feeling himself as being a subject, separate. And of course, with this comes many other negatives as well. It's not just a positive thing that gives man something that the animals don't have. Animals don't have that degree of subjectivity, let's say. Although, again, that could be debated. But for argument's sake, the trees don't have it. The nature doesn't appear to have it. The moment that subjectivity comes into the play, you think of yourself as separate and divided from the stuff of nature. You are mind and it is physical. It is matter and you are mental. But in my work, I've always focused on the things that are also negatives of that sense of subjectivity. One of them is extremely important because in philosophy, there's constant debate about what's called the subject-object dichotomy, or what's known as the dualism. Mind and matter. God and the world. All philosophers have to wrestle with this problem of dualism. Does the world really exist as your senses perceive it, or is it just basically a sort of a conception created in your mind?
Yes.
This is all known as dualism, and we have the links so people can check into this more specifically. But the dualism, the root of dualism, why you see one thing as two things, and as we said, why you have a separate identity of yourself is because of the ego and because of the subjectivity. But the problem is that, and Carl Jung was the one who really pointed this out, he said that, look, the objects of your own unconscious are also considered objects as far as the ego is concerned. And this has never been brought out sufficiently. Yes, they all know that the ego perceives the physical things of the world, the chairs, the pillows, the couch, the television, the computer. These are considered objects. That's where the word object comes from. It's objectified to you. It's not part of you. It's separate, something separate to you. But the psychologist like Jung pointed out that so does the ego perceive aspects of the unconscious. Specifically, the archetypes and other content of the unconscious is considered external to the ego. And this means, of course, that then the ego is threatened by by aspects of the self.
Yeah, exactly.
And because it is threatened on two sides, it's like Samson between two pillars. You have the phenomenon of the world threatening you to destabilize and create trauma. And you have the content of your own unconscious impinging upon the walls and the battlements of the ego. So the ego has been always described as a mass of defenses, as something that is waging a war both externally and internally. And so no understanding of the world at all, and this, by the way, helps to explain the Mysterium and why the ego might have fallen under the power of the Mysterium. It has to do partly with this conflict that the ego feels between contents of even its own self or larger self and the content of the world. Because remember, the content of the unconscious is itself created two ways. One is the Freudian way, in which things you don't like about yourself get repressed into what he referred to as the unconscious, right? So the unconscious to Freud was a dumping ground of this particular life, where things that don't conform and cause you pain, you repress. And the unconscious is also made up of the content of, in the Jungian way, of all mankind. Everyone who's ever lived, repressing. And then genetically, over time, the unconscious, which he referred to as the collective unconscious, is the dumping ground of all mankind's repressions. And then this unconscious content starts working on the ego. It tries to get in, and it influences the material world. Because as we said, mind affects world, world affects mind, and so on. And so this content of the unconscious then is seen as external to the ego, as the external world also is seen. And this is why the ego has been described as a mass of defenses. And that's why then you can understand that the ego is what it is: hierarchical, organized, orderly, conservative, and so on. It has to be. In many ways, it has to be. You have to understand the nature of why the ego is the way it is. It's because as far as it's concerned, it is surrounded by an ocean of frightening, troublesome data and phenomena that it has to protect itself against.
And in one way, this is what, animals have this too, but in another form. The brain of the animal is simply hardwired to detect danger and to just get out of the way when something is unpleasant. But we are at least given a chance to be somewhat aware of that ahead of time. I mean, we can try to predict the danger and things like that. And the difficulty here is to keep that balance, of course. But at the same time, it's almost like it's a defense mechanism. It's popped up for a reason in terms of survival. Isn't that right?
That's right. The ego is basically concerned with its own survival in many ways, and that requires it to interact with the world and get savvy and clever about the way the world works so it can do that. But the ego comes from a defensive aspect. It's armored. It's very, very armored. But getting back to the whole point of the earlier philosophers, I believe that philosophy has always been handicapped, you see, because it never took on board this idea that there was a primal trauma. And it's really unbelievable when you actually consider that the father of philosophy, Plato, it was his own father, Solon, who had gone to Egypt and brought back with him the story of the pre-Diluvian civilizations and the age of chaos and the fall of Atlantis.
Yeah, exactly.
You see what I'm saying? Here's how these things are connected. My God, how can them? In fact, where is it the first place that we hear about Atlantis?
Well, it is from Plato.
That's it. And what was Plato's day job? He was one of the greatest philosophers of the ancient world.
Yeah,
a man who looked into behavior, looked into the reasons for consciousness and so on. And yet, it's not really till the time of Julian Jaynes that anyone has really bothered, thinking about the effects of trauma. So then, in other words, how can you, if you haven't taken on board that consciousness was completely traumatized, how can you miss the fact that it is that traumatized mind that is looking for answers in nature? You see where the paradox becomes?
Yep.
How can you trust a reason that may in its roots be utterly in a state of disequilibrium and basically shell-shocked? How can you then trust any of those mental faculties to have an undistorted view of life? This is the predicament of philosophy. Of course, we didn't see it to today because it's only in recent times that we've even bothered to take the ancients seriously. All the ancient people of the world always insist that man is fallen, man is lesser now than what he was in the ancient days when he was directly in communion with what is, and they give the term Tao, or they give the term Noumena, or the Great Mystery, or whatever. Man was originally directly in rapport with that oracle of intelligence, nature, whatever you want to call it, and they claim, and this is every indigenous people and every ancient culture, talks about how man has fallen from that and has become more and more, spiritually naked as time goes by. Then you move up to today's world, and all academics believe nothing of the kind. They never even address this for the most part. And even philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who did talk about the noble savage and things like that, they were not speaking in the context I'm talking about. They still believed that man was rude and primitive until we have civilization and modernity, you see. So all modern philosophers believe that no, we were primitive and rude and savage. And it's only since the birth of civilization and the domestication of animals and agriculture and what have you, and we're moving ever towards greater heights of understanding about the world and greater sense of personal meaning, greater pluralism, blah, blah, blah. And this is where Heidegger comes in with the bad news. He says that all the philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, he's a little bit more forgiving to pre-Socratic philosophers, but according to him, from Plato and Aristotle onwards, philosophers have missed the point entirely, and we're not even dealing with the true object of philosophy, which has to do with man's actual existence, not the thoughts, not the thoughts he has gained through reason about the world. And this is incredibly revolutionary, and that's why Heidegger, as a man, they tried to silence him by labeling him a neo-Nazi, and of course the entire Jewish network of the time, the Frankfurt School, most American psychological schools and even European schools were run by Jews. And because he allied himself in the early stages with Germany, they used that as the means to drag him down. What they really wanted to do was get rid of his philosophical ideas that completely strike at the roots of all world philosophy. You see? And this is Jesuit controlled and also very much Lutheran controlled and even Jewish controlled. So Heidegger was nobody's pal, let me tell you that. And people need to know that when they see all of this information and so on. But getting back to what he said was that he basically is saying that, look, you exist. Your thoughts don't exist. Because everyone has different thoughts. The thoughts don't exist. They're not hiding behind a tree any more than God is. God is not hiding behind the clouds waiting to be trapped by this Indiana Jones type guy, He's not hiding in the valleys. He's not hiding in a hut in the woods. All the things that you conceive to explain the world don't actually exist. They're just constructs of your mind. And so the Mysterium then is basically my word for that. It's not Heidegger's word, but it's my word for something that's created by the mind that is later believed to be autonomous and distinct from your own mental understanding, you see. And that can be God, it can be heaven, it can be nirvana, it can be peace, a global brotherhood of man, fraternity, utopia, fame, success, higher meaning. Any of the things that you hear people bandying about collectively, and and people are even infected by it individually. Any of these things can never exist. First of all, they don't exist, and secondly, they're just dreamt up by man's mysterium-haunted, mysterium-possessed mind. They have no validity, and they have nothing to do with existence. And it doesn't matter. Heidegger addressed only the philosophers because he saw them as all being possessed by this. But you can take his theories and apply it to psychologists, to thinkers, to sociologists, to anyone else in the world. You see it even now with the whole climate gate thing going on.
Yeah,
that's a version of the Mysterium. You see it in mathematics, Henrik, with people thinking that oneness represents allness. You know how you hear global diversity, one world, one this, one that.
Yeah.
Oneness, by the way, from this philosophical standpoint, is itself a mysterium because there's nothing one in the universe. Nothing outside in the world of the senses, in nature, is one. Nothing. That doesn't mean to say that nothing is unique, that there's nothing out there that's unique. Every snowflake is different and unique. Every leaf is different and unique. But there's no one snowflake or just one leaf. There's no one raven. There's no one lake. There's no one rain. There's not even one sun, even though you could be deluded to think it is. No, the sun is one of billions of suns. Also, the moon is up there. There are many skies. So there's nothing of oneness. That's an abstraction in the mind, just to illustrate.
So what you're saying is, again, it goes back to its dualism, where we have a multitude, a diversity of things all around, but they're trying to simplify things by making it all one, or the oneness.
Projecting it onto the world from the mind, even though it doesn't exist, and then believing that it is really there.
So,
this is...
I'll start to catch up. Is that then the construct of the ego? The ego is trying to make it all one. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Ah.
Because the ego has to see itself as individualistic. It has a false identity. It has already... Okay, let's look at it this way. Another definition of the Mysterium... Of course, in my work I explained that there's many Mysteriums. There was the religious theological Mysterium involving God and proving God. There's the Mysterium of reason, that reason is the end-all of all man's knowledge. It separates him from the animals, and reason can be used to decode everything, so forth and so on. Technology is also a new Mysterium, by the way. But do you know what the original Mysterium is?
No.
Is man's false concept of his own identity. That is a Mysterium. In other words, the ego is the Mysterium. Mysterium is ego. Or if people find that hard to understand, let's just imagine that the two things arose at the same time. They both have the same date of birth, meaning that when the ego was created from trauma, the Mysterium also rose with it.
It says it's a kind of a side effect to it, right?
I think of them as one, but if it's convenient for people to think of them as two evil twins, joined at the hip, that it serves the same analogy. And the reason why another way to look at it is this. If you imagine that you have a mask. Remember the movie Vanilla Sky?
Oh, yeah.
Where the handsome protagonist ends up getting deformed and he has to wear a mask?
Yeah.
That is actually a movie about the Mysterium if you watch it. If people go and watch that movie, or even the movie Solaris. There's many others I could mention that deal in these philosophical motifs. But after you've listened to this, viewers have listened to this, maybe go back and watch that movie with the philosophical eyes to see what's being said. The Mysterium works precisely like a mask that you don't know is a mask. But a mask has two eyes. Imagine that one eye has a red filter on it, and the other eye has a white or a blue lens or whatever, right? Crystal filter. And when you have the mask on, and you close one eye and look through the mask, you see reality through one colored lens. When you close the other eye and look through the other eye and the mask, which has a lens, you see it with blue. This is why you have a dualism where man cannot resolve whether matter is matter or whether matter is mind. And this is infected Descartes. And of course, we're leaving people behind here if they're not familiar with philosophy. That's just too bad because there's no way of explaining it more clearly. The philosophers had this problem about whether matter exists or whether mind exists. This is why they cannot resolve it. It's the same thing you find not only in the teachings of Descartes, where he couldn't decide whether the world existed or he existed. It's the same thing you find in what's called the uncertainty principle of quantum science, in which observation changes what you look at.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so think of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle with what I'm going to say next. Man himself is schizoid. Man himself is Mysterium possessed. Man himself wears the mask of the Mysterium, and he constantly flitting between looking at creation and the meaning of life and reality with one eye open and one eye closed. Every time he looks through one eye, he sees the wave. Every time he looks through the other eye, he sees the pulse. When he looks through one eye, he sees the explicate order. When he looks through the other eye, he sees the implicate order. When he looks through one eye, he sees black, he sees white. And the other one, he sees white. With this one, he sees matter. With this one, he sees mind. Until he removes the mask and sees creation, sees reality, sees nature as he actually is meant to see with his own senses, not one that has been superimposed upon his mind, he can never resolve these matters at all. He'll just come up with different versions of the same thing, which is what the quantum scientists did. They thought they were probing into the depth of nature only to come up with the same dichotomy again. The dualism is still standing them in the face because they're taking themselves with them where they go. As Nietzsche said, the only way for man to see reality as it really is to get man out of the way. Get yourself out of the way, and then you'll see what it is.
Well, exactly. That's a really interesting point. And again, it ties into the whole thing of where, as a background, we talked about the scientific model before and where that stems from, the origins of that pretty much. And just as you say, it follows all the way up to the current time where kind of science is almost is forced to go into philosophy in order to understand what it is measuring or finding. Basically, it's very, very interesting.
It's called tautology. We can maybe put a link. It's called tautology, tautological. It just keeps going round and round on itself. No matter how man's thinking develops, he inevitably meets the same problems on the road because, as Heidegger said, you're not dealing with the fundamentals. In fact, your very search for meaning, I've gone so far as to say that your very seeking for meaning pushes away the sought. You're not dealing with the essence of everything. And your false ideas, like we said, the original Mysterium is man's corrupted, perverse, false understanding of his own selfhood, of what he thinks is his own selfhood, which is his ego. It's not his self, which is actually repressed in the unconscious. Because don't forget, we omitted to say one thing about the ancients. If the ancients were right, and man has fallen from a greater sense of wholeness and knowingness and allness, certainly I won't use the word oneness now, I'll use the word allness. If he's fallen away from that, it implies that he once upon a time was connected to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
So then the question of life is, my God, not only are we getting further and further away from it, but it implies that once upon a time, hence before the trauma that the Taoists and ancients talk about, we were actually linked to this.
Yeah.
And therefore the question arises as to whether, we are able to in fact get back and get reconnected to that. That becomes then the major question of philosophy, which is the question that I believe that Heidegger was asking.
I think that has happened for a reason too. It has happened because of the process of how we discover ourselves. Again, it has to do with the creation of the ego, has to do with the identification of the individual as well, hasn't it? That we've for whatever reason, from the creation's point of view, have been pushed out in order to understand, to kind of set ourselves aside to understand what we actually are in. Because if we're trying to observe the universe and get this objective picture of it, we must remove ourselves from it in order to understand it. Isn't that right? Would you agree on that?
That's the subjectivity that most of us have always believed is the thing that defines us from the rest of nature.
Yeah.
However, one of the dark sides of that is what is speciesism, or just plain old fascism again. When man developed this subjectivity, he immediately thought of himself as superior to every other creature on earth, which is not found in shamanism. It's not found in ancient Druidism. It is not found in Amanism. Why, in other words, did all the Egyptian gods have animal heads? Because man, before the advent of the ego, before he became a subjective creature, he had what was known as theriomorphism. He was theriomorphic, therio meaning beast, morphic meaning form. He was bestial in form, not as the Christians would look at it as being evil, but he's the voice of all nature, the actual voice, the language of the trees, the language of the animals, their story, their history, the story of the light, the story of the rain, right? People have called this animism, they've called it pantheism, they've called it whatever name they want. Man was in harmony directly. His consciousness was nature. His aura was nature, and nature was also his selfhood. There was no difference between a man's self and nature, nor is there now, by the way. Nor is there a difference between nature and the self. They're one and the same thing. It's just that the ego and the mysterium stand in the way of this. Because of not understanding this, man is now committing untold violence to not only animals, but to the nature that is his true creator. The problem with the rationalists and the problem with philosophers and the problem with theologians, and it comes from being Mysterium possessed, is that all philosophers that Heidegger was condemning, as well as the theologians, and even the atheists in their own way, we might have to explain what I mean by this, they all are looking for what is known as an essence. Explain. This is not me saying, this is them saying it. Essence. They're either looking for essence, meaning that they think that there's a consciousness under nature, God's consciousness, or God is what's called the first cause or the primal mover. That would be considered an essence. So, in other words, Heidegger is directing people. He says, when you see a swan on a lake, when you see a beam of light in front of you, you are not seeing it. You're thinking, what is the mysterious essence that belies nature?
Yeah.
You look at the mountain and you want to know what makes it tick. And also this kind of mind looks at the human body in the same way. How do I tick? How does the heart work? You know, it's the impulse behind all science. And believe me, science is not what we think it is. Science is one of the most brutal, violent, despicable things on earth. A man who is in touch with his own existence does not become a Robin Oppenheimer, a Leo Szilard, and an Albert Einstein. So these are a criminal syndicate who themselves are culpable for being off the track of looking at nature the same way, because they're deluded by their own mysterium. But if we just take it in steps for a minute, Heidegger is saying when you look at these things, you're imagining, or you've been taught to imagine, that there's some essence. This is seek for essences. And it means nothing more than even the dictionary definition of the term, which is that there's something mysterious or hidden, a thought process, a mind, a spiritus, a monad or whatever, or even, like I said, the scientists, an atomic consciousness. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some weird, magical sort of thing behind all you see. Heidegger said that existence is essence.
Yeah, exactly. It is what it is in that sense. But
it is what it is.
Again, we are filtering this the creation through our eyes, and in one way, this will later on as well get us into this idea of reality, even as a computer program that you briefly alluded to, because it's all about how do we interpret that kind of flow, the essence itself. But sorry to cut you off. Continue, Michael.
No, you're right. There's now scientists who are wondering whether we're all living in a giant virtual computer program.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, they're correct. We are. And that program is orchestrated by this Mysterium. It is literally the mad scientist behind the curtain. And, the work I've done on Mysterium is to try and also look at this problem of where did this come from? How did the program get running? And what can you do to turn it off? But the existence is itself. Is the only thing you're looking at. In other words, when you look at nature, you are seeing your creator there. It doesn't have an essence. There it is. But because you're possessed by the Mysterium, you project upon nature the ghost in the machine. You see, and this needs to be always borne in mind. So in my writing, I always say that the Mysterium is not only responsible for committing untold atrocities towards nature, man himself is violated and prostituted. He is one of the first victims himself. His own thinking is a victim of the Mysterium, because the Mysterium always directs thought to where it wants thought to go. Thought itself is not working, and Heidegger also was pointing this out, that thought itself is vagrant. Thought itself is prostituted by the presence of what I refer to as the Mysterium, which he referred to as the inauthentic life, and he referred to the authentic man as das Ein, meaning the thing in itself. Being there, the very thing that is right in front of you, is now unseen because you have this plague, this infection in the blood of your mind, so to speak.
One thing that I'm thinking about here, as you're mentioning this, is that from my point of view at this time, I also consider this to be part of the creation, part of the plan, if you will. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that I mean that it's a God behind it all, but the nature is creation, and the plan here for our journey, our experience, is that the comet or whatever caused the catastrophe, which consequently created the potentially the ego, as you mentioned before, is part of the creation plan, because we needed to be removed for a certain period of time, just in order to understand what we actually are experiencing, and then eventually go back towards it again. Do you hold that view too, or do you just consider it to be like it's all a waste? We shouldn't have gone that route to begin with, or do you think that we have learned something because of it? We're obviously not out of it yet, and the question is if we ever will be. But what's your approach to it? What's your relationship with that, Michael?
I believe it has to happen like you do, because also being a Taoist, the Taoist has a policy of non-interference. The Taoist says that nothing is wrong, nothing is right. When you see something going off in what you think is a wrong direction, that is because it is being directed by the Tao to do that.
Yeah.
And it's more elaborate than I can go into, but exactly, they claim that this needs to be because this may be man's route back to the Tao.
Yeah, exactly.
More specifically, more practically, they just say, let man do as he does. Do not interfere with the will of what is, because there is a derangement happening. Don't blame a madman for doing from doing mad things.
It's a way for us to process the experience and the only way for us to learn and to grow, to be in it and to experience it in this way in order to break free from it if we shall choose.
That's right. And remember, they would emphasize that you, first of all, can never direct a man towards the truth or the Tao. You must always only instruct a man to know that he is the truth, and he must look for it himself. The truth is what he makes of his life. There is no truth per se, generally. That's an illusion.
No objective truth, right?
There's no objective truth. There's only man seeking for the truth becomes the truth. Man is the truth and the way. Now, what has happened is part of the mysterium that man has, because he is an isolated ego, and you see, deep inside the heart of every man, or more specifically in the unconscious of every man, is his true selfhood. And so, for even in the ego, even in the consciousness of man, there is in fact an impulse for true individualism and individuality. True, not just the fake form, that's created by the pseudo individual, Hegel's social man or whatever. Now, when that impulse of true freedom and individualism starts to awaken, man is instantly thrown into conflict. He's thrown into conflict with the world that has no interest in him being a free individual, and he's thrown into conflict with the rest of his self, which is aligned with the ego and also doesn't want it. So this is where man's present angst comes from. He's in stress inside because he's at war with other aspects of his being that are conformist in form, and he's also at war with the people of the world and the world consensus, right? But the religions and the scientisms of the world know this. They know that man is seeking for his individualism and that he's never going to have it. So what they do is they create gods and Jesus Christ and these other heroic icons, these pseudo-individuals, so that man will then identify with those forms in order to appease this sense of individuality that works within his own soul, but that he cannot actually truly attain himself. It's one of these banes that comes with a subjectivity problem.
Exactly.
And therefore, well, you see, the Taoists would always, to answer your question, the Taoists would say that nothing that goes against nature's ordinances can last forever. It is only a momentary blip.
Yeah.
All evil, should it even exist, and they did believe it existed, merely carries within it the seed of its own destruction.
Yeah.
Things rise and they fall. So just give evil a lot of space. Let it do its little thing, but never have any concern at all that it's going to stop the water flowing on the waterfall, the light from shining on the lake, from the breath and the ether being there. You see, they're not interested in that, and the reason why they're not interested in it is because the Taoist has no time for anything that men generate as a collective. They also have nothing to do with anything that is created by the thoughts of men. I know this sounds really weird until you realize what the philosophical premises are underneath all of these theories. Anything that is generated by the mind of man is of secondary or almost no interest to a Taoist, because they're only interested in his existence. They're not interested in their people's image of themselves or what they have then subsequently created in the world based on those images. And they're certainly not interested in anything that civilization or mass movements create, because the Tao sees those as purely momentary aberrations in the flow of reality, you see.
It's what a quirk in a way. Very strange in that sense. And what about if we, at the end of this first hour here, Michael, begin to round things up on the note of basically the reality of existence, to go over a few more points on that. Basically what role the mind plays in the creation of the world. You mentioned computer program before, either if you want to talk more about that or specifically basically about what the power of our own imagination, the fact that we seem to create all of this as well. And you alluded to Solaris before as an example of this.
Yes, this is the power of the unconscious. The unconscious comes in very strongly because, as we said, not only does the instinct of true rebellion and true individualism reside within the unconscious of everyone, the Jungian and Freudian definitions of the unconscious, in my opinion, are somewhat flawed. They're largely correct, but there's one thing that they both somewhat lack or didn't emphasize. For Freud and Jung, the unconscious contains repressions, right? The content that you repress.
Yeah.
The only difference between them was that Freud just believed you did it in this life, and Jung said, no, there's a collective one where all mankind has been doing it. However, they didn't emphasize enough something much more interesting, and that is that at the deepest hemispheres of the unconscious is where actually the self exists, the true self, the whole self, not the ego. And it is that self that was once upon a time at the font of all knowledge, like the ancestors were commenting. That self is the self that is nature, is the self, okay? Like the lemniscate, you know? The figure 8 on its side. That self is very deeply in what we call the unconscious, and as we said before on other shows, it's only called unconscious because your ego is the light keeper and just simply won't turn the light on so that you can see the whole of your consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Imagine it like a landscape, almost like a Tolkien-like landscape where you've got a tower on one end of the horizon and another tower on the other horizon, but there's a darkness in between, you know, and you can't see them both. So there's a tower of the self and the tower of the ego, and they're just rivaling the hell out of each other, you know? But deep in the unconscious is this is the self, and that's why psychologists in general try to work with you to bring forth the self. Now, say you were to take a virtual tour of the unconscious. Say I could wave a magic wand and everyone could immediately take in just half an hour a virtual tour of everything that exists within the collective unconscious and take it like a magical ride, you know, all the way from where you are now, all the way through the darkest reservoirs of the underworld, right through the unconscious, right down to its ancestral memories, all the impressions and archetypes and all the ideas, everything that makes up the unconscious, just like going to the moon, you know, like in Solaris, just like going to the planet. Or Dune is another movie that also talks about this in a way, the ocean planet, representing the unconscious and the free men being the archetypes with the lustrous eyes and all of these kinds of things, you see.
Yeah.
And this endless emphasis on water, which is a Taoist principle, by the way. So imagine that you can take this virtual tour and then you come back. You get off the couch and you say, I've been all the way through the unconscious, right to the very first thought that ever was thought by the first man in the world. If Jung is right, that the unconscious is made up of every thought of every man, every experience of motherhood, every experience of fire, every experience of fear, every experience of a mystery, which then later on became the God idea to account for that mystery, every experience of the hunt, every experience of animal, every experience of cold, you see. Imagine you had the chance, like in that movie, also it's called, what is it? It's the Ken Russell movie. I'm thinking of...
Which one is this here?
It's the early one where they go into the big thing, they go into this suspended animation tank, and one of the guys regresses and becomes like an ape.
Oh, yeah, that's called Altered States.
Altered States, right. This is, again, what I'm talking about, that this guy actually started to regress through the limbic areas of his brain and so forth and so on. Well, imagine you could do that in just 2 minutes. According to the Jungian theory, you'd actually step out in the now, Henrik. The deeper you get into the unconscious, the more you return to the present moment. And it's fascinating how that works. If we have a few minutes, I'd like to explain it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Jung said... See, a lot of people thought that Freud and Jung were different because Jung was mystical and Freud was atheistic or practical. This is not true. Jung and Freud were on the same page. Freud said that all human experience is gained in this life. Your mind is blank, and everything that a child knows is learned in this life from experience. A lot of people who haven't read Jung very deeply think he didn't agree with that. Yes, he did. Even though he has his unconscious memory bank, which is the unconscious, the collective unconscious, is bigger than Freud's idea of the unconscious, the very first man who had the very first experience on Earth in order to create any idea at all still learnt it from experience. So Jung's idea of experience is just backdated. That's all the difference is. So in other words, if you took this virtual tour of the unconscious to get back to being the first Adam, the first man, whatever way you want to look at it, who had the first scent of a rose, who had the first feeling of water in a river running over his hand, you see, who looked up to the magnitude of the sky, who felt the heat of the sun on his face, who experienced the first color, green or blue or whatever it might have been, you see, who experienced the exhilaration of his legs running. All of these original concepts, which is the content of the unconscious. was learned from experience. So if you were to go right back to thought one, you'd step out of a door back into the world, back into the arms of Mother Nature, which was the first teacher, the first guide. In other words, it's like the beautiful poem of T.S. Eliot. In the end, right? In our endings is our beginnings, and when we arrive at the end, we return to the place of the beginning and know that place for the first time. This incredible,
nice.
The 4 quartets that he wrote. It's that kind of idea. So then, knowing this, you discover that why then have an unconscious at all if even in the Freudian and the Jungian model and in the Kantian model, because Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, is saying nothing more than Jung said, just in different terminology, then why do you even need the collective unconscious at all, or the unconscious at all, if it is itself predicated upon direct living experience or existence in the now?
Yeah, creates that shield or a sheet between yourself and the experience that you're having in a way.
Right, because remember, as we said, the society is the one that decides what the ego will repress. In other words, it decides what the content of the collective unconscious will be. Not all of it, of course, but the world that you live in and the people that you know, the mothers and fathers, priests and politicians and everything else, is largely responsible for making you repress aspects of your own selfhood into what is known as the unconscious and dumping it there. That content then acts on the world secretly behind your back, and then you interface with the world again. Okay. But because that unconscious content is influencing the world, you are not then seeing the world as Heidegger is asking you to see it and as the Taoists are asking you to see it, which is directly. You're not able to do that because, as you just said, you're projecting this sheet, you're projecting this imago, a very thick one, a very deep, conditioned imago of where the world should be, the way other people should be. Then we become our own policemen. Hey, I want you to be like I want you to be. Yeah. You can't be yourself. And that person screaming at me, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, you should be this way and you should be this way. No, you should be this way. It's called projection.
Yeah.
And we're also demanding that the world conform in this way. We ask civilizations to conform to this way. So we then, in the Heideggerian terms, have a distorted or broken mirror, or our projector is broken. The distorted program of the Mysterium is still running, and we can never see the world as it really is. And therefore, anything we build out of that distortion is going to be yet further flawed. It will just rise as a Tower of Babel, only to crash to the ground again.
And it's never been more prominent if we consider what's going on in the world today as well, with all these, again, unification, the homogeneous approach to what reality is. Never mind if the data, even in the scientific model, is skewed or not. This is the reality now, and everyone should abide to it, whatever it is concerned about. Even if it's concerned about everyone should get the vaccine, or everyone now should stop breathing pretty much because of all the carbon that you put out there. It's just incredible. It's almost like, it feels a little bit just what you said there, Michael. It's like the Tower of Babel it comes the highest just before it kind of falls and crashes down in a way, because it's so high and it's built on an unstable foundation, if you know what I mean.
Which goes back to your original point about the Taoists not interfering. They go, we'll see again. You want to head down there? Okay, we'll wait. You'll be back. But anyway, this thing that you're talking about it's no more applicable than today. Maybe in the next section I can address that specifically, though, because there's certain key parts that. How much time do we have left in this one, actually?
Well, we have a couple of minutes here, Michael. We should begin to run things up. But is there something you want to leave us with here in the first hour?
Yeah, let's introduce this then. What I'd like to say is that when we know that the Mysterium is operating and we don't see the world or other people or even ourselves, and people can pick which of those three is the worst, right?
Yeah.
It's up to them. But when you know that we're not seeing the world, other people, or ourselves as we really, really are, because it's distorted by this Mysterium that arose at the time of the falling off and the time of the birth of the ego, then we can then we've accounted for the God idea, why man throws up the God. The God is his pseudo-self. It's a pseudo-collective self shared by every single person. But the thing that really leads us into the next half is this. And this accounts for the modern rise of technology and science. And I wouldn't even say science, because I'm not bashing technicalness or science. I'm bashing what's known as scientism. Specifically, scientism is the philosophy that scientists have that only science can understand the meaning of life. Heidegger was against it. The existentialists are against it. I'm against it. Scientism is what we're really critiquing here. But there's one fundamental thing that people need to always remember when it comes to these philosophical questions. And that is, the first tutorial of the Mysterium is this. The Mysterium has convince man that remember, it's subconscious. He is the creator of nature and of his own mind. You have to understand that the mind operates, for all intents and purposes, as if it is the creator of what it sees, of nature, and even of thinking. Well, of course, a little common sense tells you that that is absolutely the opposite. Nature is the creator of not only man himself, but of the mind. Inwardly, in the depths of the ego, the mind understands this. And this is the reason for what is known as the universal antipathy towards nature. Nature is ontologically and metaphysically superior to mind, and mind doesn't like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so mind has sought to, in a sort of Strangelovian and Frankensteinian way, Dr. Frankensteinian way, to set about to try and humble and subjugate nature, and also to try and find the socket of energy into which nature is plugged, so that it can either unplug nature or at least share in its power. And of course, that it's not visible. Nature is what's called negentropic. It's self-preserving and self-creating, self-preserving, and self-monitoring. Man wants to know the secret of that power, and his technology and his science is, in fact, orchestrated to try and do that, to rival nature. You can't understand what's happening in the world today, or even the rise of philosophy or any of these other materialistic models, until this is understood. And again, it's psychologically based.
All right, Michael, let's round up then on that note and continue talking more about this in our second hour for our members. But please give up your websites again, Michael, for people who are new to your work, and where you recommend them to go in order to pick up more of your material and some of the books and DVDs that you have out there.
Well, sure. Definitely have to head over to michaeltsarion.com. If they click on the next button, it takes them to a secondary pages where all the articles are, and that's where this Disciples of the Mysterium is. This article is, and there's a bunch of other articles there. We also did, we're always updating the forum, so all the interviews we do, right? I mean, right up to the very latest ones are always posted on the What's New page of the forum, and that's available through the Michael Tsarion website. And then, of course, head over to Architects of Control link there to look at the DVD you and I did on psychology and conspiracy, which is a first of its kind examination of those two subjects and how they link together. And also we'll be posting upcoming events. This includes talks on other radio shows, and also live events will be on the calendar page of the MTSAR forum. So those are all available and constantly, updated all the time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Michael. michaeltsarion.com is the website. Check out the forum then for the latest editions, and then use the site as a portal. We have links from there to many of his other works. So stay with us, Michael, and we'll be back with more here the second hour. Hour 2 with Michael Tsarion coming up. We begin to discuss the world today, different philosophers and philosophies. And Michael ties things together for us with his Mysterium thesis and this 3-part miniseries. We talk about virtual reality, how to perceive the world, or rather how we perceive the world. We discuss the Cartesian worldview, how we are being shaped by belief and how that dominates our view of the world, not by objective observation. We discuss how nature creates the mind, anthropomorphism, the shamanic approach, the limited brain, and basically existence in its essence and the search for essence. A very interesting hour 2 coming up after this break.
You're listening to Red Eyes Radio. More coming up in hour 2 for members. Subscribe at redeyescreations.com for full access. Radio, film, video.
members, this is the second hour of our third program in our mini-series with Michael Tsarion. We are talking about the Mysterium, or the disciples of the Mysterium, a philosophical discussion basically about reality, tyranny, control, but also the mind and our relationship to the world and this experience that we're having here. Basically, where we left off, we were talking about the world today pretty much, and how all of this that we've been discussing in the first hour is very much applicable today. We're right at the cusp of where we almost can see the Tower of Babel coming down, falling down, and again, multitude and diversity is nothing that is being encouraged in our world today. It's all about oneness and kind of homogenize thinking, and basically with that, unfortunately as well, freedom is heading out the door. Comments on that, Michael?
Well, absolutely. That's why philosophy and sociology, psychology are so important, because we're not going to be able to understand what's happening. You know, science talks about the future always. It always talks about a collective, because everything in science is not the product of one man. It's a product of a chain of individual scientists working towards a certain end. Whether that end is, you know, the global village or even something more positive, it doesn't really matter. It's collectivist by its nature, in exactly the same way that religion was collectivist in the past, because there's two mysteriums. There's now the technological mysterium, and Heidegger did talk about this a lot. He always spoke extensively on the difference between the poets and the technological people. But the religious mysterium of a few decades ago, and of course it still exists somewhat, but it's pretty much dead on its feet, that always was collectivist as well, because it was one set of rules for every human being, 10 commandments for every human being, one church for all human beings, and one heaven. There wasn't many different kinds of heaven, right? There was one heaven, one God, one mediator, one church, one set of rules. This is collectivist. I don't know why people don't notice this. Technology has the same attitude in a slightly different way. It just says that one scientist cannot hope in his own lifetime to uncover the whole secret of everything. So science will. But then that is collectivist in its nature, is it not?
Well, peer reviewing, what is that all about, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. First of all, yeah, exactly. First of all, you have to be part of the hierarchy in order to even become a scientist that's going to get anywhere. Because we know that these criminals like the Oppenheimers and Zillards that I mentioned, for every one of those jokers, there's a Tesla, a Walter Russell, and a Wilhelm Reich standing in the off at stage exit left, you know, out of the limelight.
Yeah.
So there's no answer there. But even philosophically, they're implying that the utopia to which they're leading you is a collectivist one. No one scientist will know it. They're all links in a chain. No one culture will know it in your lifetime. Now, this is very, very important, because if you tie it back into Taoism and aspects of what Heidegger was saying, you'll see more clearly what the difference is. The Taoist and Heidegger are saying, look, anything that promises you any kind of collectivistic, all-encompassing answer is part of the Mysterium. You know, it's not legit. Who is to say that you, in an individual life, should not gain all knowledge about all things, including yourself and the world, in your lifetime? No organization today promises you this. And it's because Heidegger said that all philosophy, all of the world, has never been addressing the true meaning of Das Ein, which is existence and being. The Taoist is not interested in these movements because he knows that they're pursuing something that's totally elusive. And it doesn't matter what they build, they're never going to attain it. And they haven't attained it. The theologians and the idealists and the rationalists never attained the goals of reason that they offered to explain the world. It didn't happen in almost 1,000 years. Plato's forms are still as abstract as they were when he lived, and so forth and so on, you see?
Yeah.
And even though Immanuel Kant was the philosopher, it would take too long to explain this, but Immanuel Kant is extremely important because he's the one who tried to pacify and resolve the issues that stood between the so-called materialist philosophers, the empiricists, as they're called, and the rationalists. We don't have time to explore that, but I have done in the article if people want to look at that. But even Immanuel Kant had to endorse the God idea. In other words, he was still Mysterium possessed. He himself did slyly say, I know that the God doesn't exist. But as Voltaire said, if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent him, meaning that Kant and Voltaire and these rationalists suddenly started to admit, just before the time of Heidegger, that, look, we know that there is no real God, but he's a necessary idea in your mind. Again, so in other words, they're endorsing the Mysterium. They're not letting it go. And so everyone in the...
Oh, sorry to cut you off. Does that mean, in your point of view, that they're then dismissing the truth. They're hinging it on an illusion because it's safer with it than without it in a way.
Yes, they're closing the door of one mysterium only to open a door to another mysterium. They don't return back to the answer, the reality.
Yeah.
Which is why Heidegger critiqued them. And this is where the atheists and the positivists and the atomists are basically neo-Kantians. They take up Kant and say, good man, thanks a lot for telling us that God is just an idea in people's minds. That's what we were trying to tell these rationalists. So now we can run over into the pluralistic world where everybody's conception of reality, and in my opinion, a distorted version of reality, is now the real.
Yeah.
And therefore, the empiricist is now justified by Kant by saying, oh yeah, we know that there's no real God, but it's a working idea. This left the door open for them to not only endorse the previous Mysterium, but to create another Mysterium in their own minds. Specifically, that Mysterium is a false understanding of nature. Because as we said, and that's why we did it kind of in reverse. The Mysterium that haunts the materialist is the behaviorist Calvinist thing we were talking about before, in which there is no consciousness either in the mind of man or in nature at all. And therefore, this opens the way to technology, does it not? Because then the technology can say, we see man as just a machine, and so is the universe as a machine with programmable, understandable principles. Remember I said that the ego secretly wants to discover the meaning
Yep.
of the negentropia of nature. This all then opens the door to this. But there's another element to this as well, and it has to do with violence. They've known that when they study, when criminologists are studying rapists, they often understand that the rapist has a strange ambivalence, sadomasochistic tendency. He wants to murder and mutilate and hurt the object, his victim, but he also wants to own and possess and love, although that love is, of course, necrotic.
Yeah.
Right? He wants to fall in love with it. And in fact, many women have been able to pacify themselves from being raped by actually talking to the lunatic and then making him a cup of coffee and all this kind of shit and acting like he's a real human being type of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is all part of this. So all psychopaths operate this way. And technology is a sharpened weapon in which they wish to stab and probe into nature, but at the same time immerse themselves in a sort of orgiastic way into nature. This is born from my theory that originally you cut off from nature, but you can't cut that which is born from nature off from nature. At the end of the last segment, we just said that nature, a man falsely sees nature as separate to himself, but man did not create nature. Nature created man. So man, whether he likes it or not, and no matter how artificial man becomes, he cannot deny that he's part of nature, which is what the Taoists and all you see are ultimately resting their theory on.
Yeah.
Okay, but what has happened is man has become estranged from the natural within himself. So his technology then has two functions. One is to sever and dissect, and to mutilate nature in order to reveal her secrets. But it is also a perverse attempt to bond and own back the nature that he won't do in the legitimate way. Isn't this incredible?
Monsanto, patenting of seeds and just legally taking over nature in a way, genetically modify trees even, and then claiming them as your own in a way, your own creation, you know?
Here we go.
Yeah.
That's it. Putting your stamp on the very cell. Putting your stamp on the DNA. Patenting the DNA.
Yeah.
When you see what we're talking about, you start to understand. They're not listening to Fritz and Francis of Assisi. They're not listening to Feuerbach. They're not listening to Heidegger. They're not listening to the Chung Tzu and the Lao Tzus. They're not listening to the shaman who said, you and nature are one. What you do to harm nature is to harm yourself. You see these kinds of things? So they don't realize it. First of all, look at it this way. If man was truly not technological but natural, and he allowed nature, which is very mutable, it doesn't have fixed laws like people think. Those are just projections. If nature was really to form man, if man allowed himself to be shaped and formed on a daily basis by direct interaction with nature, do you know that we wouldn't even have a civilization or even a society as we know them today?
Probably not. We would would be even more, civilized, as the true term means in one way, I think.
We would, and we wouldn't have civilization, because civilization is a technological construct which stands against nature, which is the other, making nature an otherness. And then you have to bring in nature under the rules and regulations of the city.
Yeah, just another modern example. Sorry to cut you off, but we all know, we who live in the European Union know about the absurd stories about the angle of a banana, the length of a cucumber, in order to define them as food or what have you. It's regulation, extraordinaire here, and this is all basically boils down to control and also control of nature, farming industry, and the whole shebang,
Yeah, they want roses without thorns. They want cactus without spines. they're never going to be satisfied. And even the preparation of food, Henrik, even the mechanical objects that we have to cut and process food, the thing goes on and on and on into this industrial Cartesian mechanistic setup. And basically, one has to contemplate that a man who is directly in touch with nature is not a primitive. He's not going to become a savage. What he will not have is he will not have the civilizations that we know today. I've often referred to man as we know him as being thrice dead. Like the ancients say, he first of all broke off from the umbilical cord to nature. That was the first breach. Then he created a mysterium to seek for this God idea, in other words, an essence within nature, and he buried himself in that. That's twice dead. And then when that mysterium basically gave up the ghost, another was born, which is the technological model. So he's really thrice dead, is the way I look at
it. I want to talk about one point here that came up as well in regards to basically how we interpret reality and that we project our own belief onto reality, and reality in a way responds to that's proven through the Heisenberg principle that you mentioned before, or quantum mechanics, whatever we want to call it. Basically, when we had the announcement of cold fusion by Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, can't remember exactly when this was quite a few years ago now. The first thing that happened, of course, is that a lot of other scientists come along and try to replicate that experiment. It needs to be, again, peer-reviewed, and it needs to be tested and see if other people can replicate it. But what is happening there potentially as well is because they could not be able to replicate it, so they said no, it's a fraud, it's a phony. Cold fusion does not work. But what about the problem here then with progress overall, or technological progress? Because with our belief, potentially, we are even clenching progress because we might not believe that it's possible. So we're getting nowhere here, if you follow my train of thought, Michael.
We are getting nowhere because the very science itself is unfounded. There is a philosopher called Wilhelm Windelband who came up with two words to describe what you're talking about. He called it ideographic and nomothetic. Ideographic are meaningful events and experiences that cannot be replicated or ever understood with any absolute general rules or codes, because ideographic events never really truly repeat themselves. This is what nature's really going on. I think it was Sophocles or one of the other ancient masters who said you can never step on the same piece of water twice.
Exactly, yeah.
Then the nomothetic is those events that occur when you can, in fact, have scientific verifications, through replication and scientific models and so on. But my reading of this is that those are only reproducible because they're not really in reality at all. These are the mental constructs of reason and of this patriarchal, mysterium-possessed mentality. Man can only ever know his own thoughts. In the state that he is in now, he can only prove or disprove the content of his own consciousness. He cannot, in fact, know what is really real about reality until he works out these principles that we're talking about.
It's so interesting.
It's just not possible.
It's
and this is where this principle of indeterminacy, you see, the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, they run up again. They run right into the middle of it yet again, because they have never resolved these issues that Heidegger was pressing them to also understand. And remember, as I said before, it needs to be repeated. Once you have the mysterium in your consciousness, whether it's a theological one or a technological one, the victim is not only nature, the victim is one's own thinking, one's own self. For instance, don't you see how much technology today is focused on the body and the DNA?
Absolutely. It's all about
whether it's curing AIDS or the brain and curing aging and whatever hell else it is. This is also the concomitant of this perverse, anti-natural understanding of man's body as being separate from nature, the head being separate from the body, in the way that Wilhelm Reich's whole life work was to explain. And therefore the probing into the body, all the forms of machinery that they have created. I'm not against it healing disease. We're talking philosophically here, that the whole idea of this mechanistic understanding of even the human body and animals and so forth and so on. And as I said, there's even been the St. Francis of Assisi within the religious movement who've begged man to understand that God is nature is God, etc. And, they haven't bothered listening to this. And it basically boils down to, you see, that when man is born, he has this false ego, this understanding of his own self that Hegel also elaborated on, and that's his handicap. From that handicap, he starts his life process. So he's not interacting with nature anymore. He's not letting nature shape him. He's letting the thoughts of the collective shape him, his parents and everybody else. And then comes along the teachers, along comes the priests, the politicians, each one further immersing man in the mysterium. They're reinforcing the mysterium. They're not taking it away. And therefore, man today is about as estranged from his own selfhood as you could possibly imagine. And this is the danger. That's why only psychology fixes it. It's always the underlining thing of my work, is that you're never going to fix the problems externally because you're in a deadly link. You're in a deadly grip with the world that is then, again, influencing your mind. Then you raise new children and influence them accordingly, you see. Technology promises you all the future utopias and what have you. And man is not even remotely aware of his own self. He's not even dealing with his own existence. His existence has become as foreign to him as anything you could possibly imagine. Can you imagine that? A man's own existence. And there is actually a therapy, by the way, if we have time, to give examples of what I mean. For instance, in order to illustrate this, just somebody should put their two hands in front of them and just look at their hands for a moment and philosophically ask themselves, or try to imagine all the things that your own hands have felt and experienced since the time you were born. Now, your hands, not the guy next door, not your partner, nobody else. Your hands have lived in the world. The touch of fur, the touch of water, the pain that you've had catching a football when you were playing games, you see, the feeling of clothes next to your skin. Put your mind back and go right to the very room in which you were born, the cot in which you were laid, the heat of your mother's skin, the first moment that you saw a thing called a window, the first moment that you breathed your first breath of air, you see, the first moment that you saw the color green or saw fire, the first moment that you stroked a dog and felt its fur and its breath on your face. All of these different elements that are pertaining to your existence, your life, that can never be collectivized. They are, in other words, ideographic. They cannot be replicated by anyone because they're yours. They're absolutely yours. People don't think like this anymore. Yeah. They just exist in a sort of a corporatized way in which we always thinking of everybody else. We're thinking of the global good. Remember all these Mysterium projected things? Yeah. We have lost contact. What was it like when you first heard a piece of music? What was it like when, as a child, you looked at a painting and were stood stock still? Because something you saw was now transfixing you. You were transfixed with existence. These things pass by, and we give them secondary or tertiary rating to all the stuff that we're meant to think is important. And that's why you go to school and are put in a uniform. That's why you sit in cubes. That's why you sit in squares. That's why you're regimented from point go, is because you're not meant to think about that. You're not meant, remember the movie, is a very, very good movie to watch in regards to these theories, is the movie Fearless with Jeff Bridges.
Yeah.
There's several incredible scenes there of how he then becomes aware of his existence rather than his roles in his marriage and his role at work and everything. And he's sitting at a table listening to a friend of his speaking, and he's eating a strawberry. And people just need to go and watch that scene because it exemplifies what we're talking about here. How here is a man who has now become totally immersed in his own existence as he's eating the strawberry while he's just listening to the cacophony of the world around him. It's really fascinating.
So the question that arises here as well then is the difficulty also of breaking away from the memes, the mind viruses in a way around us, other people's view of the world, because again, if it's not taught, if you're not familiar with how to do it, that's going to be very difficult to do, and you need to train almost to do it. You need to, in a way, program your own mind, true mind control, so to speak. You need to control your mind not to take in other people's worldview all the time and try to focus on your own, and that's very difficult to do, Michael.
That's right. You have to do an existential reawakening of your own self. Remember, the Tao is not something that somebody's going to give you. The Tao is not going to come knocking on your door one day. The Tao begins when you start questioning philosophically who and what you are, and it's apophatic. You're not going to arrive at what the Tao is, which Tao is nothing more than your selfhood. You're not going to arrive at that directly. You must do it through an apophatic means, which is to find out all the things that are standing in the way of your selfhood. What is not selfhood? What are all the factors and forms that are holding you, both metaphysical and other, physical, metaphysical, spiritual, religious, theological, and all the rest of it? What holds you down? Because you are self-incarcerated. Man is self-incarcerated. He's imprisoned by the Mysterium. And as long as he is in this Mysterium, he has to understand why he wants it. Why has he entered into a relationship with this? He is the self-murdered individual, you see. And by being self-murdered, he murders everything else in the universe. Heidegger used to speak very poetically of how when you have this, when you're in absence of being, he said, you are what is called Das Man. There's two words, D-A-S-M-A-N. Das Man is just the man.
Yep.
Not man as an existing being, but man who's just walking in the street. Like we said in the last program, it was I think Otto Rank's twist on the Thanatos instinct. The Thanatos is really the man in his unawakened state. When you see those things and you realize that that is what's going on, you try to awaken from that. Now, all existentialists have a remedy for it. As I said, I suggest certain meditations that you can do. Just coming into look at your cells, the cells of your body, how they do not work. There's no oneness in your body.
Explain.
Right?
Explain.
Well, if a cell just suddenly decided I want to do what I want to do and started acting against the flow of what nature has decided, that would be an expression of oneness and it would destroy your body. The body is a product of nature, as is the mind. But what you think about can be a product of the mind, not nature. This is the thing. Man is haunted by his own false ideas of things. They are not the creations of nature, and therefore they do not exist. This is part of what I'm writing about. But getting back, existentialists have a particular method of their own. They claim that it is so difficult for man to get in touch with being again, and that the only way he can do that, and this is agreed upon by Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and also Sartre, even though they had so many differences, they do agree on one thing, and it's called being unto death. When a man contemplates his own mortality, like really meditates, and by the way, this is also the philosophy that opened a great deal of what's called existential literature, like the Hermann Hesses and the Steppenwolfs and Colin Wilson. You see, this also created a lot of film and a lot of books. This entered into literature about a man who then contemplates his own mortality, the finiteness of his own existence. That angst or that anxiety that he's only here for a finite time is what awakens him into the immediacy and the imminence of his own existence. He takes his existence much more seriously when he realizes that sword of Damocles is above his head. We know this is true because anyone who's ever had cancer or anyone who's been brought to death's door, what do they always tell you?
Well, it's like becoming alive again almost. They experience life in a whole new way that they've never done before.
Yeah. This is what this movie Fearless is also about. But just think I lost the trail of thought there. Oh, yes, that's right. It connects to nature again. Remember I was saying that nature creates mind and creates man?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that let's look deeply more into what it means that when we say that nature creates the mind. Scientists and the theologians and most people generally think, in other words, they don't think that you have one life to know all there is to know, but there are infinite things to know. Okay, this is axiomatic.
Yeah, indeed.
Axiomatic meaning something that cannot be freaking disproven. I mean, it's a fact of life, right? Okay, so let's just go with that. There are infinite things to learn, and I don't give a damn if you're a scientist and you're trying to learn it through science. Just as a matter of simple fact, there is infinite things to learn, but you only have one life to learn it in, right?
Yep.
Then you say, and I have a mind, which we already agree is finite. And so we discover reason. We have reason. And even the greatest psychologists, Kant and all had to finally agree that reason is a good thing, but it is absolutely incompetent to the job. Reason itself cannot know all there is to know in one life because it's limited. It has its limitations. This has been philosophically, irrefutably proven, that reason is your way to know things, but it is limited. Then you say that your lifespan, which is time, is limited.
Yes.
People might also reflect on the name of Heidegger's book was Being and Time. He was talking about this. Okay, well, wait a minute. You think this is not bloody important? That to realize that there's infinite things to know, but you have a limited lifespan in which to know it, and you also have a reason which is limited and can't know it?
What do you want to focus on? What do you want to learn, right?
Well, it comes about like this. Perhaps then the Taoists were right by saying that the very idea that you can know something in time is illusionary, which is, again, what I would say is a concomitant of the Mysterium that is deluding you that time is enough. And also you've been deluded that reason is enough, because the Taoists neither endorse time nor reason. But they also do say that you can, in fact, have all-knowing. And Heidegger was basically implying the same thing. But their methodology for understanding all there is to know about yourself and the universe is not done through time. So their science is completely given the pink slip right there. And it is also not done through reason. And there is the rationalists and the idealists are given the pink slip. And we now come full circle to what the shaman talked about, which is existence. in your existence in a deep and direct rapport, not the essences, not seeking what the essence of a beam of light is, or the essence behind a mountain, or the essence of the lake, or the essence of a color, or the essence of human beings, looking for some spirit, looking for some Geist, looking for some otherworldly thing, or even a physical utopia. You see, all of this is nonsense. This is leading man away from the question of being. There's something about his beingness that is absolutely unique. And when a man is awakened to that, when he is awakened to what Heidegger called das Ein, then the journey of real understanding begins, because the mind is now capable of that kind of understanding, because you've brought existence back into the equation, you see.
That's really interesting. And, one thing occurred to me as well. It's just simple observation about the world around you, learning and studying your surrounding, obviously, and that can be done from multiple, or in different ways, of course, but basically pointing out the absurdity of where the world is heading and pointing out the insanity of it all, kind of, as long as you don't identify it and wondering why am I insane then? Because the world seems to be, what the relationship is there. But in one way, to me, it's like you can simply point out the absurdity of the world, learn and study it to kind of, and that's enough to remove yourself from it, that they can continue in their madness, in their way, but I'm here, I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm watching it from my end, from my perspective, for me at least. What do you think, Michael?
Extremely important. This is what Ayn Rand talked about the egoistic man, that the egoistic man understands the importance of his own existence vitally. But you see, let's take it apophatically, discover why it is that you can't do those things. Instead of trying to attain it in a masculine way, you just sit and start to discover what it is about you, how you've been conditioned to not imagine this. Why do you believe, that 1 minute there's everything to learn, and then you never took it on board the fact that you have a extremely limited appearance. I mean, it's simply axiomatic that it can't be done. It simply can't be done, not by any scientist, not by any expert. And by embodying that, by still thinking that you can, you are now endorsing collectivism. You are now absolutely handing them bricks to build a new world order. Of course, they will keep promising you, don't they, that one day they'll have a supercomputer that'll be even put in your brain or your little chip, and you'll have instant access to all there is to know about everything, all this nonsense.
Right. So that's the allure, obviously, that they're giving us. So again, that's the reason for moving into the collectivist, world, pretty much, because that will open up and it will give us answers that we never had before. That's the promise, at least.
This is the beautiful carrot that they're offering you, because they know, again, that man inwardly knows what I'm talking about, that there's a big contradiction here. But when the ego has existed, remember we talked about the subjectivity aspect? Mm-hmm. This has I've listed about, I think, 5 of them, 5 negatives that come with subjectivity. One, I can go through a few of them if we have time.
Yeah.
One is, the first one we've already talked about, which is that the moment that you have a subjective ego, nature is positioned externally. It's foreign to you, basically, in substance and form. The second negative thing is that the subjective self, the ego, can now set the parameters of how the world of reality will be viewed. Meaning that you're not seeing the world as it really is, you're deciding, it's like you creating a little cinema window, and all reality has to pass in front of that window. Remember that the metaphor of the 3 blind men feeling a elephant, and everyone had to report what they thought it was?
I never heard that one, actually, I know.
Yeah, it's an Indian metaphor about an elephant is brought in front of 3 blind men, and each man is told to go and feel this elephant. They don't know what it is. And then they're all meant to describe it, being blind, and each one, of course, writes down it's a large mouse. I don't know, they come up with all sorts of weird, it's a snake, it's a serpent, So this is what the mind is doing to reality. It's asking, it's like camera obscura, and everything in reality is meant to pass by this little window, but you've set the length, breadth, and heights and focus of that. The ego is now given this, and it's called freedom. The ego is now given the freedom to do that. People can think about that. The next thing that happens is that the ego can do the same thing with its own vision of self. The ego has not only put a window vista to the world like that, it has put the similar vista with prearranged coordinates to the unconscious, or like we said, the greater self. So it monitors and polices and censors and filters a man's vision of his own self, right?
Yeah.
And the last thing that it does, one of the other things that it does anyway, by the way, not to forget saying that by filtering the world, what the mind ends up with then after 13 years, 20 years, whatever, is all of its own content about what it feels the world is. It set those parameters to monitor the world so that it could gain an understanding of what the world is. In the end, Henrik, the understanding of what the world is becomes more important than what the world is.
Yeah, well, exactly. And again, I come from the point of view that there's a reason and a function for that from the brain's point of view, because I think that if we would have opened the floodgates, so to speak, where we take in everything, it would just be too much, meaning that the limited point of view that we have is actually very good, but we cannot allow ourselves to be defined by it as well. We need to know that it is limited and for what reasons it's limited. And when we realize that, maybe then we can consciously begin to expand, and get the full perspective. You know what I mean?
Although I would say that comes from the influence of the Mysterium.
Explain.
The idea that we think that if we were left to open to the world and all the stimuli, it would be too much is an illusion.
Mm.
It is that way for the ego, but then the ego is the Mysterium haunted thing. It's setting the parameters of what we know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one has to sort of doubt that. I don't think so. I think that if you actually could get rid or downplay the ego, or at least put it in its own place, or remove these parameters, you might have a completely different experience. But then again,
obviously, absolutely, and
we could argue.
Very interesting that idea. Actually, I haven't thought about that.
But one of the last things is that we've got to notice that the mind, because it is now filled with these ideas about world, that it is already filtered and arranged in a hierarchical model, that storage becomes that data about the world then becomes the world. So what I see, it ties into your first question about where we're heading with technology. This is a technological arrangement, because the ego has acted technologically. It has filtered and screened out the data of the world and arranged it in a certain hierarchical form. That form then becomes more important than the world as it really is. And as time goes by, man is actually losing reality. Mm. And this is why you even have in the last 20, 30 years the rise of things that are literally called virtual reality.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, this is the advent of computer games, of certain kinds of interactive movies. I'm not saying it's bad. Remember, we're not talking about good and bad and wrong and right. We're just saying, look at how these things arise. You plant the seed, something will grow from it. Yeah. All of this virtuosity and sort of a proxy and voyeurism that we see in the world, and even the technologies to make life smoother, to make life more interesting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is part of this, because man actually knows he and nature, he and reality are getting further and further apart. The global village is the ultimate concomitant of that, just like was shown by Patrick McGowan in The Prisoner.
That's really really interesting. And again, the emergence of virtual reality going into games, and again, it's all about the fact that we go deeper also into the illusion, because again, if we tie it back with the ideas we talked about before, that we might already in one way be living in a computer-generated reality. I mean, it can be an organic computer in that sense, or more like just a function of it, that it operates like a computer program. But now what we're doing is that we're getting another one inside this one, and we're going just deeper and deeper into the illusion, if you know what I mean.
Right. And then the one of the last things that the subjective mind is able to do is this. It not only loses interest in with the real. Remember the time when man was connected to the noumena? Like I said, he was linked umbilically to the nature.
The bicameral mind again, basically.
Yeah. Before he was subjective. Of course, this is always the very word neter, N-E-T-E-R, meant the godly or the spiritual. In Egyptian was the word we get nature from. Mm-hmm. And they had a reason for having theriomorphic gods, is because they were coming from this state in which nature and mind was one. I believe that sort of changed, again, going back to the time of Akhenaten or slightly before. But anyway, because this has happened, in the time when man was connected to nature, you might want to look at it this way, that man's face was reflected back to him directly in nature. Nature was man and man was nature. He was one. He was connected. When the ego came about, it's almost like the projection of man's own visage in nature faded. In other words, nature dropped man's image, because man was no longer there. It's literally man had ceased to exist. He's a simulacra of what man really was. Now when man is in the subjective state, he hungrily and desperately, especially since the age of trauma when the ego was born, it looked back into nature to find its face there and didn't find it. Not realizing that ego is the cause. And ever since, man has been looking to find its face in nature. Not being able to find his face in nature, he became even more disturbed, and his antipathy towards nature increased.
Is
technology.
Is that you think when we start to kind of, how should we put it, project our image onto it, meaning that we anthropomorphize things, we put a smiley face on the sun, etc.?
That's it. Anthropomorphism is the dire consequence of a lot of historical philosophy and technology. It's even haunted many decent forms of eco-philosophy and so on and so forth. And man, through his technology, one aspect of his technology is that he is now desperately trying to embed his own face again where it is no longer there.
Right. What is, just explain what you mean by eco. What do you say? Eco.
Well, the eco-philosophers, like the deep ecology movement and.
Right. Like, for instance, we identify with the polar bear, so that becomes the symbol of the climatic change movement. Is that what you're talking about?
No, not necessarily. I'm speaking about certain schools that are like neo-pagan, or they do want a much more holistic. They do realize that God is nature, nature is God.
Mm-hmm.
And they preach this, that let's get out of civilizations. This sort of anarchistic model.
Okay, I see what you mean. Okay, yeah.
They're good, I believe. I'm very much in favor of some of what these guys are doing. But some of them have this anthropomorphic, romantic idea, you see. And that's, again, an inauthentic way of seeing human beings there. It's not altogether negative. I mean, William Wordsworth, if you read his poetry, he's right on the ball, and many of them, other ones were as well. And, of course, Rainier Mary Rilke and others who've done this, and Holderlin. There's so much beauty in the poetry that do talk about this, because they're not victims of the technological mindset, of course. The poets are, by definition, even Heidegger agreed, the ones who are back in a natural rapport with the natural. But when you're not, you then, through technology, force your footprint onto nature. Mm. And this is what then is happening now with all of these colonializations and colonizations of indigenous peoples, and making them modern and contaminating them, and putting Coca-Cola ad billboards in the jungle and projections and all the rest of it. All of this is born out of this idea to again find man's visage, but not in a holistic way. Once upon a time, man looked into nature and saw himself. Now he wants to do it again, but in an artificial way. This is very, very deadly.
What do you make of all the, because that seems to be, I guess, an incentive or an idea right now as well, is that the world is also slowly kind of turning towards very much of the anti-consumerism. The world is turning away from, let's, just as you mentioned that the Coca-Cola sign in the jungle, that is frowned upon now in one way, and that's also going out the door. Where do you see, does that stem from a true, point of view, do you think, or do you see some danger with the anti-consumerism, anti-industrialization that's going on now as well, Michael?
Well, I see it as pretty much positive if man can get back to some of these, existential philosophical points. And don't forget that it doesn't mean that technology doesn't have a role in the lives of awakened people. And of course, didn't even the shamanic people have to use horses?
Yeah, sure, of course. And
which is technology.
Technology is even the use of entheogenic substance, for instance. That's a form of technology too, or fire, or whatever, what have you.
Making a fishing net to catch fish.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah. So it's not technology is wrong in itself. It's what it's being used for and how it's being used for. If it's being used so that the ego can gain a certain suzerainty that once upon a time the whole self had, well, then we're in deep trouble. But if the technology can aid and abet man to do this thinking process and link him back to nature as it really is, then by all means that is very, very positive. Mm. So the technology is ambivalent itself. It can be used for different purposes, you see.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about basically the Cartesian worldview and the Descartes and so forth?
Yeah, because Descartes is one of the idealists, rationalists, whose own process of thought exemplifies the man who's haunted by the Mysterium. That's why in the article I talk about Descartes as being disciple of the Mysterium, taking the Heideggerian principle that all the philosophers since Plato, including Plato, were disciples of the lie, or that they had taken philosophy off in the wrong direction. And Descartes was one we assiduously studied him back in the days when I took the classes in Belfast, and therefore we were really up to speed on his teachings. And basically what Descartes had the problem was he sat down to basically convince himself that he existed. And his process was what we know today to be skepticism, that he would doubt everything about himself and everything about the world. He would subject all of that to rigorous doubt. And it's what later became known as the skeptical school. And his process, after a long period of time, he decided that he could be sure that he existed because of his capacity to doubt. If he could doubt, then he must be a thinking animal. And if he thought, it implied that there was a thinker there, and therefore He said, "Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am," the famous motto.
Yeah.
Then where the flaw is there is that he didn't question, if you're using thought as a proof of existence, you're assuming that your thought is wholesome and rational and perfect. But what happens if it's not? Can you still then be thought to exist if your thinking was flawed in the first place?
Very difficult question. I don't think so.
Right.
I don't think so.
Or at least by his own definition, you couldn't.
Yeah.
He might argue, no, even if my thought is deficient, I still am thinking, therefore I know I exist. But actually, if you really want to be split hairs about it, no, you can't. Because if your thinking is itself not true thought, or as if I say, thought has been perverted by the presence of the Mysterium and a false sense of identity, I don't think you can use that as a justification to actually say you exist. But then Descartes moved on, because remember, in the Descartesian model, in the Cartesian model, mind, body, and world are three separate things. This is what's called Cartesian dualism that infected all the philosophers. Remember, I told you it's because of the mask that we wear. We wear the Mysterium mask, and we look out through different eyes, and therefore we can never resolve this dualism problem.
Yeah.
But he even said that God was separate. To all rationalists and idealists, God is a separate Mysterium that is even outside the mind. So the next step for Descartes was then to say, now that I know that I exist, how can I then be sure that the objects of the world exist?
Yeah.
And and in the beginning, he was very doubtful of it. He said, I know my senses see it, but I could be deluded about it. And then after a little bit more thought, he said, oh no, I can't be deluded about it. And here's the reason. He said that I know that God created all. He created me, he created the reason, and he created the world. Remember, as we talked earlier, this is the Mysterium of theologians. They do not say nature created God, created man, created mind. They claim that a concept of their own minds. Now you got to really get the logic of this, or the illogic of it. They say this is rationalism for you. A figment of my own imagination that I believe is absolutely outside of me. It's not a mental creation, even though it is. I trust that to endorse and to verify for me that I exist, and that also the world exists. Because in Descartes' model, he said that since God has created the world, God would never lie to me. God is not a deceiver. The devil is the deceiver. God would never deceive me. And therefore, I can be sure that the world as I see it exists because God would never lie to me. And on paper, this sounded wonderful, and it started an entire school of philosophy.
So it goes back to belief again. It's all about belief. You can't prove anything.
Right, because as we said earlier on, the thoughts of man are not nature created. They're mind created. And you can twist it in whatever way you want. In other words, but it's even something more sinister is happening there in the Cartesian model. Why did Descartes, by the same token, and as a philosopher, not say, now that I know that I think, I can be sure that the world exists. I go to my own proof for the world existing. I know that it existed because I exist. He goes to a Mysterium and says, I trust the Mysterium, which is the perverse creation of my own mind, and use that as the prima facie evidence that the world exists. Do you see how convoluted this becomes?
Yeah.
Maybe even if he had come from an existentialist point of view and go, look, I just trust that the world exists because I know I do, maybe he would have been onto something there. But he didn't.
Could it be that he, lived in a time, because I can't recall this now, what era he lived in, could the church still be involved here in some way, meaning that he incorporated this into his worldview in order to not be, hanged or something for being a heretic?
Well, this is what we were taught. It's true. That's what Alan, my philosophy teacher, insisted, that Descartes wanted to save himself from being thrown into a dungeon, and therefore had an elaborate propaganda campaign to make his own philosophy look Christianized.
Yeah.
Because he would have been dragged out and hung, really tortured. So, yes, that's part of it. But nevertheless, since that we can't be 100% sure of that, we have to go by his own philosophy. We can't think about these possible
outcomes or versions of what he did. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're speculative, you see. All we can know is what the man wrote down. And as far as he's concerned, his philosophy said that God, that is not me. God is outside nature. God is the prime mover. He is not going to deceive me, so I can trust. But when we look at that from an existential point of view, it has no validity. And therefore, all forms of rationalism and idealism arose, even the Hegelian forms and all of this, are made null and void. And in fact, they were already made null and void under their own weight. By the time of Immanuel Kant, the entire rationalistic ship had ground to a complete halt, and along came Kant to try and resolve those issues, and that itself is a very fascinating story, which we don't have time to get into.
Well, again then, Michael, to sorry to bring this up again then, but just to make the modern example, climate gate and all this stuff again, it's being that data is being dismissed basically in the mainstream media for the same reasons that we're talking about here. It's supposed to be science, but it isn't. It isn't the observance of the actual data that is taken into effect here. It's a belief that what we can see with the data that they have revealed is that it's true. So it doesn't matter if people lie or skew the data in order to prove that it's right, because we need to do something about it, and we know now that this is the case. So what I'm getting to here again is that the scientific model, the principle, and all this is more based on belief than actual observance of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a reflection basically of what you're bringing up here in the past, and what this is based on has its reflections out to what we can see in the world today again.
That's right. And remember, most of the schools of philosophy, all the good that they ever created was to continually bash the other school.
Yeah, exactly.
For centuries, they were just fussing over minutiae, which had never really added anything to the world. When the atheism comes along to finally replace the rationalism and the theology, it doesn't really create anything new. Atheists don't return back to, and that includes most of the materialists and what have you today, who are behind the science world. They don't turn back to what is really the question of existence. They just create another mysterium for themselves. That mysterium shares many of the effects of the previous mysterium. You may have taken off the sort of theological edge to it, but you still have the same mysterium when it comes to psychology. In other words, like we said, the mysterium creates a false understanding of oneself. Well, the people who are running the world today are still disaffected by that. That didn't go out the door just because they said there's no God.
Right, exactly.
Right? They still have a faulty understanding of their own existence. And secondly, they even have a deeper mysterium, which is a false understanding of nature itself. Right? Nature has become the new, or not nature itself, but a perverted understanding of nature, which is partly anthropomorphic and other problem, technological, that it doesn't have a consciousness and so forth and so on, became the new form of mysterium. And see, when that one's dead, there'll be another one.
Yeah, of course. It's the new God, basically, the new religion that you're talking about, right? Because again, if it's true what you say about the death of Christianity and all the other religions, then humankind might want to go for something else. They want to have something to still cling on to, a new mysterium, just as you say.
And this is what has been happening right across the board. There's many examples of this, by the way. If you study the works of many of the people who are behind this cyber, the sort of cybernetic movement and the genetics movement and what have you, you see that it is a false understanding of the body. It is a false understanding of nature that is ultimately behind what they're doing.
Yeah.
The whole idea that fixing what isn't broken and so forth and so on. This is, again, a misunderstanding of how nature operates and what nature is. And until people really understand these fundamentals, understand the depth of the delusion in which they're caught in, there's never going to be really any quantum change. Remember we said at the very beginning that this concept of the mysterium is a definition of human neurosis.
Yeah.
If we face the fact that at the time of the birth of the ego, this mysterium came into existence, either it's an epiphenomena of ego existence, or it even is the ego, or it is what helps you to have this mythical, phantasmic understanding of your self-identity, then we see that anything that contradicts the programming of the mysterium, yes, is the reason why people are becoming neurotic. Because even though you have a mysterium, it doesn't mean that nature ceases to exist. It doesn't matter, as you earlier mentioned, that the instincts, like the animals you said operate on the instincts, remember?
Yeah.
Those instincts are called archetypes from psychology. They still exist. In fact, as we said, the self exists in the deepest hemisphere of man's mind. Those things still exist and still work on the consciousness regardless of how you repress them. In fact, in many schools of psychology, including Freudian, the more you repress something, the more you set yourself up for it to work on you.
Yeah.
Take that one step further, and when we said that all repressed content works to become fate, remember that whole idea that what you don't look at within yourself turns up Outside of you is fate, the old Jungian principle.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see how important this is? This ties into why the Taoists probably did have this non-interference policy. They knew fine well that the man who is struggling with himself, who desperately wants to repress his true self, he's not going to win that battle because that sense of self is too strong. And the very act of suppressing it, suppression is what the world does, repression is what we do. So the mind the unconscious mind, all the content of the unconscious is put there because of suppression by the world, to which you must conform in order to have a worldly existence. And it is repressed by your own ego in order to create a false homeostasis so that you can feel that you have this false sense of identity. But those repressed aspects of yourself have many ways of coming back and invading your consciousness and pulling you back to the true homeostasis, which man for centuries and millennia now has tried to resist, you see?
Mm.
So the tension is then created between the non-man, the inexistent man, and the existent man. Existence, nature, will always be there. It will always creep up on you. Heisenberg said it. He goes, are we really seeing an experiment as we want to, or are we seeing... He has a quote somewhere, it's in the article I wrote, where he says, we don't see nature as it really is. We see only our impressions about nature.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer said, the world is my idea. Hegel, others, they've all said this. So man is then trapped in this bubble. Like I said, he's wearing this mask that's been sort of nailed onto his skull that he has to deal with. And therefore, there's something about the real that always pulls you back. But it does it through a chemical divorce mechanism. It does it through deconstruction, not construction. The Taoists, the Zen, the Jains, the Druids, they all knew that because you stand in opposition to what is real, you set yourself up to attract the very forces of destruction, if you want, or deconstruction more correctly, that will work upon your falseness to drag it down. Figulus, the alchemist, he said that nothing changes unless it is first broken down to its first matter. Mm-hmm. The whole idea that carbon is the basis and all that. Until things are broken down into their basic elements, you can never have the phoenix rise from the ashes. So what we're looking at now is the and you were hinting at this earlier, there is something happening in nature already. There's something happening outside of man's own sphere of influence that is causing an erosion of the mechanisms. You see these false phantasms that have become created. The self will not be suppressed. It will call man back, or it will destroy him. It will destroy the constructs that he's living in the shadow of this great beast. It will literally he'll build it up and build it up and build it up, only for it to either topple again, so that he comes back to the true state of existence. The man who does this through his volition, the man who does this of his own will, that's a different creature. He has to step outside the norms, the song Tom Sawyer by Rush. He's got to go against the flow. His mind is not gonna be for rent, to any god or government.
So I guess, Michael, to summarize here a little bit of what we've been talking about, control in one way and evil, forget about it. You've got nothing to worry about. Obviously, learn from it, know what it is, study it in order to not be consumed in that sense by it. But if it's meant to collapse, it will. And I guess what you're saying as well, then discover yourself. That's your recommendation here.
That's my recommendation. There are meditations that you can do, like we talked about the delusion of oneness, and to be very aware of how that term is used. There's an old adage. You see, the actual emblem of the Taoists was a thing called a tomo, and it was like the Celtic three spirals.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right? They thought of the number 3 as being much more exemplary of man as an existence. That was the gateway to the noumena, as opposed to oneness. Ideas of the number 1 are the gateway to illusion and the gateway to the noumena, because again, oneness is a conception of mind. 3ness actually exists. 2ness actually exists. Right? You can have 2 stones, you can have 2 rivers, you can have 2 ravens, you can have 3, you can have 4, but you can't have 1.
Well, is that kind of dovetails with the idea that everything will cast a shadow as well, yes. In a way. If you have one thing, then it will immediately, as it's in our universe, if you will, it will cast a shadow and will become 2. It will split itself in some way.
Or let's go even to the holon theory or holographic theory, whereas the thing that is seemingly 1 actually contains within it the entire universe.
Yeah, of course, exactly.
It's many,
Yeah.
right? And instead of, because they knew that there would be confusion, they didn't even use the number 1 as a symbol. They used the number 3. And do you know that even in the Christian model, it turned out that the God who started as 1 ended up having to become a Trinity? Isn't there something unusual about that?
Yeah,
that it ended
exactly.
up being God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. They couldn't even keep it as a singularity because the singularity is meaningless.
That's a good point.
This is an important aspect as well. And the threeness, don't forget that man is an expression of 3, because as we said, that man is a creation of nature, but nature has ordained it that man is created from what? 2 parents. So each child that is born is a 3.
Yeah, it's the sum of the 2 coming together. Oh,
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So man's hallmark, as far as nature is concerned, say you were nature and you were looking at it, nature has ordained that every single creature, and even every animal that exists, is an expression of threeness. And threeness was known as delta in Greek, daleth in Hebrew, right? It was symbolized by the triangle, and we know how important the triangle and the 3 spirals were to the Druids and to so many other ancient shamanic peoples, you see. They always spoke in terms of this. The concept of the 3 is another way to look at that. So I also often use that as a metaphor for people to contemplate so that they understand how they have these mental abstract delusions in them and come back to sort of, realize how these delusions work. And again, earlier we talked about this thing called facticity. There's actually a term in existential psychology and philosophy called facticity. And facticity is the element where you totally are in touch with your own particular existence. Like I said, go back, and if somebody can even do this physically, do it. Go back to the room in which you were born. Go back to the cot in which you laid. Go back to the first experiences that you had when you were young, and then go from there. Try to track, even if you only have to do it in your mind, then okay. But even if you can do some of this physical, look at the clothes that you once wore. Look at the pencil that you once wrote with in school. These things lie in the attic, so to speak. And Heidegger was very much into this. He was always talking about how you don't see the doorknob when you open it. You have no feeling when you sit in a chair of that experience. What is the chair doing? Does it have a life of its own, Why do you never contemplate your relationship with the light, with the chair that you sit on, with the knife and fork that you eat from, with your own body, with your own cells, with the way your eyes blink, with the color blue? Do you have any relationship yourself with the color green, or is it just there and everybody has a relationship with it and it's just basically invisible, and you have this numbness, this comfortable numbness with everything that exists in the world? What does a tree mean for you? What was your first scent of air like when you first realized the wind is on your face, and so forth and so on? These are what roots a man back in his own existence. When you go to the mountain, instead of looking at the mountain and wanting to know its essence, why don't you link with it animistically and find out what it would like to be a mountain? Get into direct communion, you see, with the thing itself, which is you. You are the whole on. You are in everything, and everything is in you. It's these types of contemplations that help us get out of the illusion and to shatter this whole Mysterium possession that is basically operates like a parasite on the mind of man. It is literally works very parasitically in the consciousness of human beings, and it is born out of trauma, no less as the ego was born. They're 2 evil twins that were born together, and in fact they may be even indistinguishable. Even the science is there if people read Julian Jaynes and a few other people there, and especially Heidegger, because Heidegger was adamant that the philosophers who were meant to be the ones that were seeking for the truth of life and the meaning of life were utterly wrong. First of all, man is the only one who can give meaning to his life, because man is the only one who thinks up the thoughts about meaning. All that man can know is his thoughts about things, but he's also got to be able to doubt those thoughts. He's got to understand the root of where those thoughts are coming from. Are those thoughts just a product of your social persona? Are they conditioned by how other people see you and the approval ratings, that you don't really have a sense of self at all? All of these questions that we've tried to deal with in these 3 interviews need to be all taken holistically. And never forget that the ancient men said that man had in fact fallen. He's not progressing, he is falling away from the oracle or the font of all truth. So are we doing that? Are we getting further away, or are we actually getting closer? And second most important thing, to never lose the idea or the understanding, never to help your mind be deluded, both consciously or unconsciously, that you have any creation over your own mind or nature. Nature is the prime datum. Nature created God, as the Taoists are saying. They created your mind, and it created man. You are if you want to call it, subservient metaphysically and ontologically to nature. And therefore, the acts that you do towards nature, personally and under the guise of technology, you are literally doing it to your creator. So one day, walk out in nature, wherever you happen to be, and say hello to your creator, because there she is, lying right in front of you every single day. When you wake up in the morning, do you ever greet the day and say, hello, day? Thank you for housing me. Thank you for being here. I am walking through you today. What relationship do we have with time? What relationship do we have to the light that greets our eyes every morning? That's just something that happens. When, Heidegger used to say that when the eyes are open and the light meets your eyes, it is at that moment that you must say hello. And he used the word thankfulness. And he said that the same German word for thank you is the same word, Henrik, as thinking. It's the word root for thinking and for gratitude are the same in German. So that your very thought must be an act of gratitude. First and foremost, to be embraced by the day that it is your relation. You are related to it. It embraces you like a mother. And everything you do and think and enjoy during the day is made possible by the day. It's not just a functional dead thing without consciousness. And in doing that, in awakening that kind of relationship, you yourself then reawaken the same kind of natural consciousness within yourself by doing that, because one string vibrates with the other string. The moment that you see nature as being real and alive and animate, not some essence hidden behind it, some spooky mysterium, but itself is living right there, and that each tree, each leaf is an altar to that noumena, automatically nature's voice, the voice of the animals, the voice of the trees, the voice of the atoms, the voice of the air, speaks to you directly, not collectively. There is no collective enlightenment. There is no collective utopia. There is no collective illumination. In the end of the scenes of the movie The Silent Flute, it was written by Bruce Lee and James Coburn. That's what they say. There is no enlightenment outside yourself. And everyone must examine in their own mind how they've been sold that lie, that there is an enlightenment, an illumination, a knowledge, a peace, a satori outside of yourself and your existence. That is evil. That is the thing that is destroying the world as we know it today.
Okay, Michael, let's begin here to round things up for this time. As always, very interesting, good points, and thank you again for coming on the program, talking about your work and research with us, Michael. Mention your website then again for us so we know where to go.
Okay, great. And thanks a lot again, Henrik, for the opportunity, because again, this is like one of the first ever instances in which, two unlikely disciplines, philosophy and conspiracy, have been tied together in this particular way. So I'm very, very grateful, that you've provided the time and
Absolutely.
The intelligence to do that. It's a great, again, that's one of the positive, well, you can never be wholeheartedly pessimistic, because we are in times in which we can review history and review the past and review what we know about ourselves in order to, again, every minute is a new beginning. Like T.S. Eliot said, in our endings is our beginning. And when we arrive at the place, we know it for the first time. So again, every moment is a potential starting ground to learning the right way and doing what is needed correctly, the right way.
That line, by the way, is even in Vanilla Sky, actually, if people check that out. But
is that a fact?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, Michael, websites for us.
Well, michaeltsarion.com. They need to click on the next button, and they'll take them to It'll take them to the Disciples of the Mysterium article, and also to the other articles there. We'll put up all the links relevant to this talk on the Red Ice page, I hope, so that people can then continue to connect the dots and look into this a little bit more. It doesn't really take a lot of time, to do that. We've provided the information, and again, all feedback is welcome. So michaeltsarion.com, the contact information is there, and look out for, even future discussions along these lines, both relating to psychology and to philosophy.
Okay, there we have it. Links up on redicecreations.com as well, to originsandoracles.com, Michael's DVD series, architectsofcontrol.com, and of course, again, then the main website, michaeltsarion.com. Thank you again, Michael. Take good care, and we will continue talking more soon, okay?
Thank you, Henrik. It's a great pleasure. Thanks a lot.
That concludes our mini-series with Michael Tsarion. I want to thank you for listening and for joining us here in our members area. We will be back soon with more radio and Red Ice TV, of course, as well. Take a look at that. Links from the front page. My thanks to Fredrik, Elizabeth, and Lana. We will talk more soon. Take care, and bye-bye.